Over the past decade and more, there has been significant investment in Melbourne's rail network, which has included elimination of numerous single-track bottlenecks. Nevertheless, there are still several locations on our rail network where single-track remains a capacity constraint. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of these bottlenecks, whether there are plans to eliminate them, and what could be done in the future. Today, single-track sections are no longer as significant a constraint as they have been in the past, and it's worth taking a look over what has been done in recent years to eliminate them. Over the past couple of decades, several single-track sections have been eliminated. In the southeast, the Dandenong to Cranbourne line was upgraded from single to double track in 2022, eliminating one of the longest sections of single track on the network, and allowing for considerably improved public transport connection to this growing area. On the Hurstbridge line, the track has been duplicated between Heidelberg and Rosanna, Greensborough and Montmorency, and Diamond Creek to Wattle Glen as part of the Hurstbridge line upgrade in recent years. The line between Keon Park and Epping was duplicated in 2012 as part of the South Morang extension, while a section of the Altona loop was duplicated in 2018. Despite all of these projects, however, single-track sections remain a capacity constraint on the Melbourne rail network, and a pretty major one at that. We're going to go through all of these and examine what is planned as well as what could be done to alleviate their impact. Although the Burnley Group has some of the most developed infrastructure of any rail group in Melbourne, with a well-designed 4-track section between Burnley and Flinders Street among other things, there is only one line on this group that does not have a single-track section, the Glen Waverley line. By contrast, all 3 lines running through Camberwell have single-track sections. The Alamein line is one of Melbourne's least used rail lines and also has one of the shortest single-track sections on the network. Just north of Ashburton station, the line reduces from double to single track, with Ashburton and Alamein stations both having just a single track, and around 800 metres of single track connects the two. This section of track is not particularly a constraint on service, given its short length and the minimal ridership of the Alamein line regardless. However, it would nevertheless be worth investigating. A project to, at minimum, add a second platform at Ashburton station would definitely be welcome, and I suspect it would not be particularly complicated to duplicate the line down to just north of Alamein station, which, given its low ridership, could very easily be left as just a single track. The main question with this potential project would be whether it could be justified on economic terms. The Alamein line already receives reasonable service frequency in peak hour, and given the low rates of population growth in the area, at least at the moment, the area is unlikely to need service expansion, and hence, the single track line is not a particularly big concern. Indeed, there are no plans at all to duplicate this line, with not even the PTV Network Development Plan from 2012, one of the more ambitious plans in recent years, suggesting that the line should be duplicated. I do suspect that the line may be duplicated at some point in the future, but that would only occur with some sort of transit-oriented development or upzoning. Further east, the Belgrave line is single-tracked between Ferntree Gully and Belgrave. Originally, the suburban line ended at Upper Ferntree Gully, with a narrow-gauge steam railway continuing to Belgrave and Gembrook, much of which later became Puffing Billy. The line between Upper Ferntree Gully and Belgrave was converted to the suburban electric train line in 1962, and has been almost unchanged since. This section of single track is certainly a constraint on services. Generally, the line at most has a service of every 15 minutes in both directions, with service more frequently in the peak direction at the expense of counter-peak service. For example, in the morning peak hour, trains run roughly every 10 minutes towards Melbourne, but only every 20 to 30 minutes towards Belgrave. Although passing loops are provided at Upper Ferntree Gully and Upway, during peak hours, these often cause delays as trains will miss their allocated crossing times, holding up trains in the other direction. To some degree, this section of line can therefore be considered as worthy of at least partial duplication, although, given the not particularly high usage and the especially low density population for an urbanised part of Melbourne, this could potentially not be necessary. In the past, it has been considered somewhat important to ultimately duplicate the line from Ferntree Gully to Upper Ferntree Gully, a relatively short 2-kilometre section with basically no obstacles in the way and reasonably busy usage. However, beyond Upper Ferntree Gully, there are many more questions over the justification of duplication. This area is rather low density, with limited public transport demand, and there is very minimal need for improved service frequency. Additionally, the fact that this section was originally a narrow gauge railway means that the corridor is quite narrow in parts, such as at Tacoma Station, where property acquisition could potentially be needed for any duplication. The only potentially justified expansion would be a duplication to Upway, and even that is not particularly justified. It seems most sensible to duplicate to Upper Ferntree Gully and then leave the remainder of the line single track, allowing some improvement in reliability, as well as better access to the sidings at Upper Ferntree Gully, while not being too excessive. The line from Mooroolbark to Lilydale is often considered one of the most likely lines to be duplicated. This section sees decent ridership in comparison to many end-of-line sections, and additionally, there are plans to redevelop the Cave Hill area into a suburb at some future date. At a length of 4.4 kilometres, the single track between Mooroolbark and Lilydale is one of the longer sections on the network, and it limits access to Lilydale's stabling sidings. While the current government does not have any plans to duplicate the line from Mooroolbark to Lilydale, and in fact recently rebuilt both stations without duplicating the line in the meantime, it would seem almost certain that whenever the Cave Hill area is redeveloped, this section will be duplicated alongside construction of a new station. I would personally expect this to occur sometime in the next 15 to 20 years. The Hurstbridge line previously had a very long single track section, with 15 kilometres of line from Greensborough to Hurstbridge being fully single track. However, in recent years, the line has been duplicated from Greensborough to Montmorency and Diamond Creek to Wattle Glen. You can see my video on that. Nevertheless, the line from Montmorency to Diamond Creek, an 8 kilometre section, and Wattle Glen to Hurstbridge, a 3 kilometre section, remains single track. Although the section from Wattle Glen to Hurstbridge seems very unlikely to ever be duplicated to me, given the low demand and low population, there is a decent case for duplication to Eltham. This project was considered a reasonable medium-term priority in the PTV Network Development Plan 2014, given the population in Eltham and the low service frequency. Although this has been somewhat alleviated with the Montmorency duplication, the remaining 2.5 kilometre section continues to be a constraint and is certainly not going away. Additionally, there is still some population growth continuing in the Eltham area, and hence there'll be demand for improved public transport. The main issue with this section is the existence of a wooden trestle bridge at Eltham. This is essentially the last of its kind on a mainline railway in Victoria, and it has become a bit of a local icon. While there is very minimal issue regarding duplication on each end of the bridge, besides some concerns over butterflies that seem a little bit misguided, the trestle bridge is a significant issue that cannot be avoided at all. I believe that the ideal solutions here would be to retain the bridge as a very short single track section, to construct a second single track bridge on one side of the existing trestle, leaving it in use, or to construct a double track bridge on one side, which would allow the trestle to be converted to a mixed use path. I suspect that one of the first two options would be the most viable. I don't expect this issue to be resolved within the short term, but certainly within 10 to 20 years it will probably be duplicated. The remainder of the single track from Eltham to Diamond Creek and Wattle Glen to Hurstbridge is not particularly likely to ever be duplicated. There are occasionally plans put forth to build a station at Eltham North at Allendale Road, but given the fact that this would be significant urban sprawl in an area that, to a large extent, still contains some of the best protected nature areas close to Melbourne, I suspect this would be very unpopular and I don't think it will ever occur. Additionally, Diamond Creek, Wattle Glen and Hurstbridge are basically just little towns on the edge of Melbourne, and hence, this line has a demand that is more akin to a regional railway than a suburban service. This means that there is very minimal demand for public transport out here, and so I don't think this section will ever be duplicated. The Upfield line has a single track section between Gowrie and Upfield. This section is very likely to be duplicated sometime soon, given that it is both relatively short and in a growth area. Indeed, there is a plan to construct the so-called Somerton Rail Link, whereby the line from Gowrie to Upfield will be duplicated, extended to Craigieburn on the former rail alignment, and then electrified to Wallen, significantly expanding the reach of the public transport corridor. I've got a separate video on this, hence I won't get into it too much, but regardless, it is very likely that this short section will be duplicated, perhaps within 10 to 15 years. The final section of single track on Melbourne's network that is worthy of note is the Altona Loop. The Altona Loop is the modern existence of the old Altona line. This was originally a branch line that was completely separate from the Werribee line, but in the mid-1980s it was linked up with the rest of the Werribee line, including a new station at Westona. Owing to space and financial constraints, this was built as a single track line, and the entire Altona Loop remains so, excepting a short section that was duplicated at the eastern end of the line as part of a level crossing removal in 2018. There are currently no other plans to duplicate this section. It remains a major capacity constraint owing to the long section of single track with only one passing loop, which means that many services bypass this section during peak hours and on weekdays, instead running express from Newport to Laverton. Between Seaholme and Westona, there is a major space constraint which would likely prohibit most attempts at line duplication. Personally, I would suggest that there is a small possibility that a narrow skyrail could be constructed through this section, which may potentially be able to have two tracks, but I obviously don't have the means to test this proposal. Nevertheless, it has been proposed that the section from Corrigan Creek Road, the current end of the double track, to Seaholme, as well as from Westona to Laverton, should be duplicated in the future, which would allow for the single track section to be considerably reduced, allowing for improved frequency on the line, something that is certainly demanded but can't be provided at the current time. This will possibly occur at some time in the medium term future, but there's no guarantee. Thank you for watching this video on these constraints on Melbourne's rail network. I hope to get some more videos out in the near future as I've got more time to produce them. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video sometime soon.